Hi folks, welcome to Experiential Realism. I hope you guys enjoyed my exchange with Edith from the Emily's Visions podcast in defense of monistic idealism. That got me thinking about how we perceive our reality as human beings and how malleable our screens of perception might become when we pass away. What I mean by this is that we might become less restricted in what we can perceive if we no longer identify as human beings. I think of Rupert Spira's room space analogy. The walls of the room could be analogous to the filtration system of the brain, making us believe that all we are is the space contained within the walls. We believe we are finite, restricted, but once those walls come down, we realise that we are much more. And we also realise there was only space all along, only consciousness. I also recall reading Bernardo Kastrup's article about near-death experiences and the afterlife reality, where he describes an interesting hypothesis. There is only consciousness and its realm of imagination. Even the waking world, like dreams, is imagined. But the world that we share is a collective mental construct and for that reason tends to have more momentum, more continuity, and exhibits more autonomy independent of individual sentient beings with their personal minds than, say, a dream which we tend to think of as a sleep hallucination. And that's not to say that solipsism is necessarily true in dreams, because the truth is that we can't even be sure whether some dream characters are just semblances of sentience on our screen of perception, or truly representations of other loci of awareness within us, perhaps sub-personalities or ephemeral alter egos that find expression for as long as the dream lasts. But it's certainly the case that dreams have less momentum and continuity than waking life. It is also true that when we are lucid in a dream, that is, when we know that we are dreaming whilst dreaming, we are able to have more control. And if we are really confident that we can change things, we can exercise godlike powers in the dream world. And here we realise that the dream is more malleable or has less autonomy independent of the dreamer. Kastrup posits that the afterlife realm, where we are more expanded and no longer tethered to the restrictions of a human ego, would also be malleable with far less momentum, and where the lines between individual minds begin to blur and a sense of oneness or wholeness is more apparent. What is perceived in the afterlife, according to this hypothesis, is still representational qualia of an underlying reality of meaning within consciousness. This could explain why people can experience life reviews, which is a common theme in NDEs, and they experience them in nuanced or different ways. People in NDEs can also ostensibly recall past lives in idiosyncratic ways. For instance, someone might see a sequence of slides in their visual field with content that jogs their memory about previous lives. Someone else might be taken to a spacious room by hooded figures and shown myriad screens all playing the lives that were once lived. These are actually examples I've come across, and quite a lot of NDEs have a hard time finding the words to describe their mystical experiences. Some claim to have felt so expanded and so free in their near-death state that they felt unbounded by space and time and were able to acquire near omniscience and attain mnemonic powers far beyond what a human being is capable of. One patient even claimed to have been able to think far more in a second than what would normally take a person to contemplate in months or even years. For some reason, this made me think about a scientific breakthrough that was reported in an issue of the New Scientist magazine almost a decade ago now, where ultra-fast lasers measured how long electrons take to be booted from a helium atom with zeptosecond precision, trillionths of a billionth of a second. That's how unbelievably fast electrons fled the atom. Our human minds can't even imagine such a tiny sliver of time. But if we disconnect from our human form, presumably we become the mind of nature, and what was once incomprehensible becomes direct knowledge. I'd also like to talk about nightmarish or unpleasant NDEs, because so far in my videos I have only mentioned pleasant ones in depth, for the most part, and that's because over 90% of NDEs are characterized by blissful states where people often experience a sense of being expanded, at one with everything, unconditional love, and are also able to enjoy beautiful realms full of joy. People also struggle to describe these experiences, which are so out of the ordinary, and some tend to use language based on what they know or learned or were brought up to believe in. I've come across reports where religious people in particular say things like, "There was a bright light full of love and I have no doubt it was the Lord." Or something like, "There was a robed man guiding me. I think he was Jesus. He looked better than I imagined him." And even secular people tend to use terms like heavenly realm to convey what they experienced. Maybe the concept of heaven comes from these mystical experiences. Maybe the numinous aspect of certain states of consciousness is what inspired the term or the concept of heaven, and it never started as make-believing wish-wash or hocus-pocus. But people have also described going to hell, and I suspect these NDEs are rarer because people don't want to talk about them. Evidence also suggests that your character or personality, whether you're good or bad, doesn't seem to determine where you go any more than positive and pleasant individuals are spared nightmares. There are inmates, career criminals even, who had NDEs in prison and they reported blissful states and feeling unconditional love. And the rare people who report having experienced hellish NDEs have been described by others who know them as good people and model citizens. So perhaps there is something to the dark night of the soul that even figures like Mother Teresa related going through as a necessary first step towards the divine. I suspect there are many more hellish NDEs unreported out there because people are ashamed to say that they went to hell, and perhaps some are traumatized as we speak and fearful of what awaits them once they pop their clogs. In the TV series Lucifer by Tom Capinos, there was an interesting concept about hell and what kept people there. People who went to hell kept reliving where they went wrong in life and remained there until their attitude about those events changed. And they were essentially their own worst nightmare, their own worst enemy, I should say. There is a character called Charlotte Richards, a lawyer who goes to hell because she feels guilty for helping several criminals escape from prison. When she returns to her body on Earth, she is reluctant to tell anybody about her experience, and her personality also changes. She becomes kinder and more scrupulous, as if her experience of hell caused her to develop a conscience. But that's fiction. And don't get me wrong, I like fiction and I love how imaginative people can be. But I'm more interested in real events and real experiences, especially when trying to figure out how reality works. A real report of a hellish NDE is that of Brenda's, and it was an unpleasant experience brought about by attempted suicide. A 26-year-old Brenda had overdosed on sleeping pills. A doctor told her she was dying before she lost control of her body and the ability to speak. She felt her body slow down while events around her seemed to be speeding up, which is interesting in itself. Subsequently, she felt like she was slipping down a wet slide and she felt cold and surrounded by darkness. When she reached the bottom, she found herself at the entrance of a drab cave displaying earthly colours. She heard cries, moans, wails, screaming, and the gnashing of teeth, and eventually saw grotesque humanoids coloured in red, green, and purple hues. She was afraid of these monsters, even though they sounded like they were tormented or in agony. She stood at the entrance of the cave and didn't dare to go inside, saying to herself, "I don't want to stay here." Brenda then tried to lift herself up and out of what felt like a pit before waking up as she was recovering from the overdose. After that, she began treatment for depression and attended AA meetings, and even though she had experienced a nightmarish NDE, her new belief that death is not the end gave her hope and motivation to turn her life around, and she eventually became a counsellor and went on to help other people. So perhaps she saw what she needed to see in her NDE. It seems to have given her the impetus to improve her situation and also do some good in the world. It gave her the motivation to do something about it in a weird way. And then there are also NDEs which sound like fairy tales and can certainly evoke sadness, like the following one mentioned on Jeffrey Long's paper on NDE studies, and I quote, "I was in the car taking my girlfriend to her parents' home in Welland. I fell asleep while driving and then realised that we were out of our bodies and flying quickly upward while holding hands. We flew straight up for about a minute. We then saw a park or countryside-like landscape. Suddenly we encountered 4 creatures. 2 flanked each of us, and they began to separate us gently. They overwhelmed us with a feeling of the highest love and compassion beyond anything we could experience on earth. We were feeling a divine love, therefore we did not resist their effort. I felt sort of like a child, a baby in mother's arms, though it's hard to describe accurately. 2 of the creatures moved her upward toward the distant landscape, and 2 moved me back downward. I felt so much love, peace and comfort that I wanted to protest and say, 'No, please let me stay here.' But I heard inwardly or psychically that I couldn't stay. Next, I saw my car in flames from about a quarter mile up above. I felt a falling sensation and awakened in the car. The front was on fire. I moved her from leaning on me, as she was when I fell asleep, knowing that her body was only an empty shell. I had left her above with the beings." Unquote. Some shared near-death experiences include awareness of another person dying geographically far away, or without the NDE knowing that the person they encountered in their NDE was dying. An example of this is from a woman called Jennifer who had several NDEs in succession on and off due to surgical complications. Her shared NDE occurred in Florida, yet she interacted with her uncle who died unexpectedly at the same time in Pennsylvania. This is Jennifer, and I quote, "During the other NDE I was in my late uncle's operating room in Pennsylvania. My relatives and I did not know that Uncle Bill went into the hospital for elective surgery to remove some polyps. He wasn't ill, so it should have been an easy routine operation. I found myself together with him, hovering in the corner of his operating room, watching his medical team cover his dead body. We didn't speak or look at each other. He was not wearing glasses as he had in life. I had a shape or form, as did Uncle Bill. We communicated without speaking or using words. We communicated with a meaning that conveyed a knowing. I don't know how to express it. We watched them cover his body, and we then left the room. I understood that I was the only person of my relatives who was aware of my uncle's passing. After I recovered consciousness, I wondered why nobody talked about my uncle's death. Why hadn't anyone mentioned it? I then realised that they were not aware my uncle had died. This was confirmed when I asked what happened to Uncle Bill, and they didn't know what I was talking about." Unquote. As you can see, there is an ostensible objective component to these experiences that can't be easily dismissed. Materialists and hylomaniacs like Matt Dillahunty will try to dismiss them as coincidental hallucinations and tend to proclaim that the mind is what the brain does. But to equate who you truly are at the core with an image in consciousness, which represents a mental doing, is a desperate attempt to safeguard one's metaphysical assumptions against what doesn't seem to fit. But, as Bernardo Kastrup would put it, a smile isn't happiness. It is merely an expression which appears to betray happiness. Our bodies are merely the extrinsic appearance of human mentation. The brain is what a human mind looks like from a second or third person perspective. The extrinsic appearance does not capture the richness and fullness of someone's inner life. it doesn't tell us anything about the first-person ontology. The answer to what happens to someone who dies could be extremely nuanced and convoluted. Eastern traditions in Taoism and Chinese Buddhism describe a variety of realms in which a soul can be reborn, and souls die many times in many different bodies or forms, death being only a transition. For instance, Hinduism and Buddhism have the concept of a preta, or hungry ghost, which is the wandering spirit of a dead person who is never at rest. In Buddhism in particular, if upon dying you are reborn as a preta, you will be a ghost tortured by hunger and thirst, and hence the reason why hungry ghosts are depicted as having large stomachs and tiny mouths. Apparently, upon dying as a human being, one first becomes a regular ghost before the energy of this new body expires, and the spirit undergoes a second death or transition before being reborn as something else according to its karma. It is said that if upon death you fail to recognize the light of clear consciousness as your very essence, you will be drawn to rebirth in the illusory realms and will continue to be trapped in the wheel of samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth. The concept of karma here plays a role, like cause and effect, in determining the journey of the soul. Good intentions and deeds are widely believed to lead to pleasant rebirths in pleasant realms. The opposite leads to undesirable worlds and an inferior existence, where the cultivation of good karma is almost impossible, and beings in this situation often don't progress or evolve beyond their existential quagmire. Being reborn as a hungry ghost, an animal, or a being in one of the hell realms is inferior to being born as a human. Even better than being born as a human is coming back as an asura, which is a kind of demigod. And if you have excellent karma, you can be exalted to the status of a deva, which is a heavenly being or deity. The Sanskrit word deva means shiny and also divine. Asuras fear the higher beings, and they come in different personalities. In the Vedas, the good asuras are known as Adityas, and these are guided by the sky god Varuna, who is associated with justice and truth. Varuna is also the son of the goddess Aditi, a boundless or limitless deity whose name also means innocence. In the Vedanta, she is the primal substance. She is the mother of deities and the synthesis of all things in the Akasha, which is sky, another word for sky or space. Hindu texts also speak of malevolent asuras known as Davanas, who are opposed to the benevolent gods known as Devas. There is also the concept of Rakshasas, which are malevolent supernatural beings who reside on earth and also feature in folk Islam, who are said to be demons that can eat people. It's something like out of a horror film, really. In Indian traditions, you also get bhutas, who are restless spirits of deceased people who suffered violent deaths and struggle to move on, seemingly unable to reincarnate or to progress towards nirvana. One can also be reborn as a yaksha, or a nature spirit, which is redolent of Patrick Harpur's Daimons. These can be benevolent but sometimes mischievous or capricious and tend to live in forests or the wilderness. In Chinese Buddhism, people like Hitler, Stalin, Mao and Pol Pot and dictators of that sort are reborn as denizens of hell who are constantly tortured. So that's many people will say this is good to know. Lesser evil can lead to being reborn as an animal, and less bad karma still can result in becoming a hungry ghost. But hungry ghosts are still bad, even though they might not have perpetrated mass murder or genocide in previous lives. In the Huayan Sutra, killing, stealing, and sexual misconduct are usually the sins that lead to hungry ghost existence. The Sanskrit word Naraka refers to hell realms and purgatory as a dark journey in the afterlife. Redolent of the teachings of Emanuel Swedenborg, finding yourself in a Naraka isn't the result of being judged or punished by divine beings or entities. When you die, according to this line of thinking in Eastern traditions, you become your true self, but are subsequently drawn to Narakas due to bad karma accumulated in previous lives. Perhaps, like in many NDEs, there is a life review when souls end up judging themselves, or are subsequently drawn to the experiences of those who suffered at their hands, in a bid to empathise and better understand their victims. You also don't stay in Narakas forever, although it is said that one can remain in hell for an incomprehensible amount of time. In Mahayana Buddhism, there are many types of hells characterized by degrees of coldness and hotness, and you also get disgusting realms of torture or derelict and gloomy environments where one might experience drowning in a swamp of pus and die only to be reborn in a new body for further suffering. The reason why I am mentioning these beliefs about hells in the afterlife is purely to gather more conceptual information beyond the scarcity of nightmarish NDE reports. I guess it's my attempt to fill that void with something, even if hypothetical for the time being. If most people who have had a close brush with death refuse or are reluctant to talk about extremely unpleasant experiences that defy explanation and indicate a terrifying unknown, at least we can look at ancient texts that appear to name, categorize, and conceptualize that unknown and provide us with tentative narratives, even if they are contextually religious. Personally, I'm not a religious person, and I happen to think that some aspects of the NDE contradict some of these beliefs, especially when there are cases of people in prisons who committed heinous crimes and have also reported blissful NDEs. We should always remind ourselves that we are currently investigating and seeing everything through an anthropic lens. We are limited monkeys on a rock floating in space, and we constantly surround ourselves with stories about experienced phenomena. And sometimes stories get things wrong or fail to capture the richness of what was really experienced. Many NDEs say it felt normal to communicate telepathically with the beings in their experiences at the time they were happening. But in hindsight, when they recall their NDEs, it dawns on them how strange and mystical they were. It's redolent of the common experience we get when dreaming. We get this experience from dreaming, while they are happening, everything seems normal and appears to make sense. Upon awakening, however, we realise how weird and illogical our dreams really were. By the way, if you weren't afraid of the afterlife, I bet you feel a bit apprehensive about it now. It is often said, a la Freud, that people like to believe in an afterlife for comfort or because they are afraid of the dark, as it were. But human psychology isn't this black and white. There are idealists like Kastrup who fear the afterlife and actually felt more at ease with the finality of death under physicalism. People like James Tartaglia tried to smuggle in that comforting finality in their idealist metaphysics, but it doesn't work. When I interviewed him, Professor Tartaglia was clearly averse to the idea of a boring afterlife where people ramble on about philosophy, and he certainly had no justification for holding on to the physicalist finality, as I pointed out, when I said that if it's all experience and consciousness is irreducible and indestructible, you don't get the luxury of cessation. You don't get to be liberated from experience as promised by the doctrine of philosophical materialism if you are consciousness itself, the eternal witness. There is no unconscious oblivion because you are not that. As the late Christopher Hitchens must have found out immediately upon his death, the party continues willy-nilly. You are the eternal witness. There is no escape, Hitch. See, this is the nightmare that many idealists contemplate and have to contend with, and some rue the day they abandoned materialism in their search for a more cogent metaphysics. You can't have the cake and eat it too. You can't say, in the same breath, that death isn't something to be feared because you cease to exist and therefore there is no one to experience and nothing there to be experienced, and that you won't even know you are dead and there won't be a you to even not know anything, and also claim that people psychologically prefer the alternative, which is more experience in the beyond, which is unknown and carries with it the possibility of a continued existence under conditions far worse than the current ones. Most people would rather contemplate oblivion upon death than the possibility of eternal damnation, or even suffering for an inordinate amount of time. This is why people would rather be anaesthetized during potentially painful medical procedures, or why many drink themselves to a stupor in order to forget traumatic experiences, zone out of uncomfortable situations at present, or block out past misdeeds or regrets. So, honestly, next time someone accuses you of holding a fanciful airy-fairy worldview because you're a philosophical idealist, you can tell them that you don't fantasize about the prospect of nightmares beyond physical death, and you can add that you have the balls to contemplate and face the great experiential unknown and don't have the luxury to dismiss it, with the relief, I might add, in the service of a flawed metaphysics such as materialism. We grab the bull by the horns in idealism, and we are honest enough to admit the implications of an afterlife allowed by nature, instead of taking refuge in the concept of the liberation that thanatological finality brings. That way you can be done with materialist malarkey that includes the virtue signalling claim that they are brave enough to accept the supposed non-existent darkness that the rest of us supposedly fear. Of course, there is consolation in the thought that our deceased loved ones haven't really died, that they merely transitioned, but the thought that they are in hell, or the thought that they can see us still suffering in this life, is equally distressing. Now contrast that with the notion that we all end up in the same non-state, the same oblivion, where we will be totally none the wiser. In fact, according to this physicalist notion, there is no being anything and thus no suffering either. Also no happiness anymore. But don't worry, because there is no one to miss it, and you won't be missing being yourself, and thus won't miss your loved ones. Everything is fine when you don't exist. You become existentially untouchable. And they will tell you that if you can't wrap your head around this ineffable and counterintuitive concept, don't worry, it's not like anything anyway. Unwittingly, they create an antinomy, a paradox, the paradox of death under philosophical materialism. By saying it is not like anything, they seem to say that nothingness is a state of being, as something unlike anything experienced, which appears to be contradictory. And when you point out that nothingness isn't something real, and that it's only an abstraction, and they agree with you, they still appear to be flummoxed by the affirmation that you can't be in a state that doesn't exist by definition if it's supposed to be a non-state. There are obviously forces at work that we don't yet understand, and we must also take scriptural narratives with a pinch of salt, especially when we as a species have a tendency towards anthropomorphism when addressing the deities and gods we speak of, which very clearly represent forces of nature and aspects of human psychology. For example, Jungian archetypes like the fool tend to be depicted as animals or human-looking characters. The jester is redolent of the clown, which can symbolize encouragement for children to take the first step in trying something novel without fearing mistakes or failure. They show kids that blunders are okay. In fact, they can be funny, and we can learn from them without letting them bruise our ego. Through blunders, we come to know where we're at about something, and we also learn about ourselves, and that can encourage growth. The jester can also symbolise common sense and honesty, particularly the Shakespearean court jester in King Lear, who brings insight and advice to the monarch and takes advantage of his role to freely speak and mock the ruler's impulses. Note that the jester is allowed to do this even though it is considered a lesser character than the citizens who would definitely be incarcerated or executed for the same feats. In a similar vein, we all think it's normal when a child has a tantrum in a supermarket, but if we saw an adult behaving in exactly the same way, like in that hilarious Vicks Kid and Mum tantrum commercial, we might think about calling the police and deem the adult to be in need of being sectioned. There is a sense in which an adult is expected to know better, to behave differently, to conform. The jester, then, appears to represent a primordial aspect of our consciousness, a bit like the Mad Hatter in Alice's Wonderland, idiosyncratically being playful with language and innocently having fun with made-up words, representing the age of innocence and immaturity, which is wonderful but often deemed to be impractical and silly in the world of adults. The jester is the archetype that is allowed to err for the sake of insight. It also goes by the name of trickster because it promises change, which can be tricky in its defiance of conventional behaviour. And yes, it is true that children are also tempted to take what they think is the path of least resistance, meaning that they can be deceitful sometimes, a move that in itself can bring about profound lessons about truth being the best policy. The Grim Reaper is also thought of as the personification of death, having the appearance of a hooded figure like the last ghost who reveals to Ebenezer Scrooge his grim and morbid future. And people do report hooded beings in NDEs. I've also seen hooded figures in altered states of consciousness such as hypnagogia, hypnopompia and lucid dreaming. And this reminds me of the third man factor, which is an intriguing syndrome and mysterious phenomenon in psychology. This is when people sense a presence comforting them or guiding them in life-threatening situations, which some people describe as guardian angels and spirit guides. An example of this is depicted in Alfonso Cuarón's film Gravity, where two astronauts played by George Clooney and Sandra Bullock become stranded in space. Clooney's character dies and Bullock's character desperately tries to survive for the rest of the film, and without giving too much away, there comes a point when she hears and sees her colleague after he's supposed to be deceased, and he's comforting her and giving her advice. He almost appears to be all-knowing, flawless. Later, of course, she realises she was alone the whole time. The term third man factor appears to come from what Sir Ernest Shackleton wrote in his diary about what he and his men experienced during their Antarctic expedition, where they were stranded for more than 2 years. Shackleton wrote that during that long and racking march of 36 hours over the unnamed mountains and glaciers of South Georgia, it seemed to him often that they were 4, not 3. A reference to this phenomenon is also found in The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot, where it says, "Who is the third who walks always beside you? When I count, There are only you and I together, but when I look ahead, up the white road, there is always another one walking beside you, gliding wrapped in a brown mantle, hooded. I do not know whether a man or a woman, but who is that on the other side of you? This certainly brings to mind A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge, as I mentioned before, is visited by a hooded being that represents the ghost of Christmas yet to come. By the way, I think the word third in third man factor actually comes from The Wasteland, but T.S. Eliot was inspired by Ernest Shackleton's experience anyway. But the perceived presence in the actual experience doesn't have to be a fourth presence. It can happen to just one person, just like in the film Gravity. In psychology, it is usually seen as a coping mechanism in the face of extreme adversity rather than encounters with spirits or otherworldly beings. Others postulate that it is a product of bicameral mentality, something that was hypothesized by Julian James, where brain hemispheres were once divided in humans, and where the more holistic half would inform the other once they began to connect. According to the theory, when the two hemispheres were united and became more consolidated in evolution, metacognition was born. The third man factor would then be, according to James, a hallucinatory byproduct of lateralization of brain function. This hypothesis would be undermined, of course, if split-brained people started reporting this syndrome. But I haven't come across any such reports, and they may be out there. It is certainly important to make distinctions between hallucinations and mystical experiences which appear to go beyond the mere subjective playing tricks on you. There are many examples in NDE studies clearly showing why there are differences. Why they are different, sorry. For example, a suicidal man had overdosed on hospital drugs, and before he collapsed, he found it hard to think straight and hallucinated little people apparently stopping him from reaching the phone. Subsequently, he was watching his unconscious body from the ceiling, and he could think clearly and faster than ever. He also said his senses were heightened and noticed that the little people were gone. He also accurately described the behaviour of the doctor who rescued him. The conclusion he arrived at, in hindsight, was that whilst in the body he had hallucinated little people because he was identifying with a malfunctioning brain and body. Once he was free from that, adopting a perspective outside of his body, he was unrestricted and perceived with great clarity objectively real events. Now contrast this with cases where people are in a state of extreme confusion and think they've gone to hell. As in the case of a Formula One racer, he was in an accident where he breathed in toxic fumes and was rushed to hospital. He thought he had gone to a hellish dark place with a foul stench, where he wrestled with ghouls with only eyes on their faces, no mouths and no noses, and they kept sticking needles in him. In reality, he wasn't unconscious in the hospital, but he looked panicked and confused as he wrestled with the doctors who wore masks and were trying to sedate him. He goes back to the point I've made in previous videos about the fact that we can be mistaken about the contents of consciousness, but never about consciousness itself. Consciousness is the only thing I know that can't possibly be an illusion. How can one be mistaken about being conscious? Illusions always presuppose a conscious observer who is mistaken about what's being perceived. And sometimes what's being perceived is what we think it is, but may not be exactly what it looks like to us. There might be instances where we are actually seeing a ghost, and how it looks makes us conclude that the spirit world is a diaphanous realm, lacking definition, because the ghost seems to lack definition, is see-through, when in actual fact it might just be what it looks like on the human screen of perception. If anything, if NDEs are glimpses of an afterlife, the spirit world is anything but a tenuous reality. It is often described as rich in colour, eidetic, and apparently far more real than this world. In fact, even in our world of physicality, appearances can be deceiving. From a distance and under certain lighting conditions, it is possible for us to mistake a rope on the floor for a snake. The object being perceived is misinterpreted because at first it looks like something else. An illusion is a misidentification about something that exists, and such misidentification can only occur in consciousness, which is where things are said to exist. But we can never be mistaken about being conscious. To say that consciousness is an illusion is tantamount to saying that it doesn't exist. It flies in the face of reason. It's like absurdly saying, I'm not really conscious. It only seems to me like I am. Well, to whom is it seeming? Another conscious observer? If people like Neil deGrasse Tyson are going to insist obtusely that consciousness is only an illusion, then one can only conclude that the seeming is the reality, which still requires explanation under the physicalist paradigm. The hard problem arises from the metaphysical position of materialism, or physicalism if you prefer, which declares that only unconscious elements in reality exist and that minds are only illusory. The metaphysical proposition itself is extremely problematic because it states that, as Daniel Dennett concluded, minds don't really exist. The hard problem is an impasse under physicalism. You will never be able to show how unconscious elements can generate qualitative experiences because all you can point to is the quantity of those elements in motion and in interaction. Consciousness is a first-person ontology, which means that you'd have to be that system in order to know what it is like to be that system. I'm not saying that dirt and water are conscious either, but we can certainly say that the only benchmark for consciousness that we have is certainly the human experience. Everything else is speculation. We can only declare that there are many unknowns, especially when it comes to consciousness and the nature of reality itself. Where there are unknowns, one can't possibly declare that puzzles have been solved, and this is the mistake that many physicalists out there make. What I find to be most likely is that consciousness is not only fundamental, but also the ultimate reality. It is the only thing that we can be sure of with absolute certainty. The world we perceive may be an illusion for all we know. We may all be in a brain in a vat scenario, akin to the one in the Matrix, but no machine, mad scientist, or devil pulling the wool over your eyes about reality can ever convince you that you are not really conscious. Consciousness is an undeniably brute fact of reality. We are undoubtedly conscious, and conscious of something, whatever the nature of that something may be. I've touched upon the fact that as human beings we are restricted and constricted loci of consciousness, only privy to finite amounts of information about reality. We are manifested, dissociated alters of the mind at large, like whirlpools on the face of an ocean, as Castrop would put it. Particles don't really exist. They are mental concepts based on appearances in our field of awareness. Measured particles are excitations of the unified field. The smaller the object, the greater its de Broglie wave, the reason why a single electron is spread out throughout the entire universe. So the smaller you get, the bigger you are, and the bigger you are, the smaller you get. You become a smaller wave of influence as you become more localized, as is the case with dissociated human alters and other classical representations in this macroscopic realm compared to single electrons. Quantum physics seems to favour analytic idealism over physicalism. I am also wondering if some of these academics are using the word panpsychism loosely as an umbrella term to include panexperientialism, cosmopsychism, or even idealism in general. Perhaps that's why Kastrup precisely calls it constitutive panpsychism when criticising the premise behind what is meant by panpsychism in academia. This kind of panpsychism is a form of dualism because it says that matter exists as fundamental and that the space-time fabric is inherently proto-conscious and comes together to give rise to phenomenal consciousness and then metacognition. But then I'm wondering if some are, notice how it doesn't solve the hard problem at all. This is why I don't subscribe to panpsychism. But then I'm wondering if some are viewing idealism as a subset of panpsychism, in that all, which is pan, is consciousness, spirit, mind, psyche, in the sense that another kind of panpsychism is monistic, which is essentially idealism. This could turn into a semantic game, but it's important that things don't get lost in translation. I've always been making this distinction as soon as I understood what idealism meant. If the world is a kind of mental appearance, an idea, a thought or dream in universal consciousness, then idealism is not panpsychism, because not all appearances on a screen of perception are representative of a locus of awareness or indicative of a first-person ontology. Some representations are merely dreamed in consciousness, as opposed to being dissociated waking life dreamers, as it were. And this principle seems to apply to the imagery in the near-death experience, which often reflects the NDEs state of mind. Hooded figures also feature in NDEs, like a much-needed third-man factor. It's not just an all-loving light or a peaceful healing darkness. It is beings of light, or sometimes hooded figures acting as guides, and in some cases the guides are deceased loved ones. The places where people go can vary, such as holding places or states of mind before moving towards a bright light. People also report heavenly realms like beautiful countrysides with ultra-real colours, rivers, rainbows, and golden cities, which allude to what the Theosophists referred to as summerlands in the afterlife. Emanuel Swedenborg spoke of many realms of different tremulations which souls are drawn to according to the vibratory frequency they happen to be in. His visions evidenced for him heavenly realms that couples in love may enjoy together for thousands of years before they move on, stating that perception of time can be more fluid as there are less experiential restrictions. Swedenborg also claimed that when you die you become your truer self, naked as it were, and everything is revealed to you and you also see the wider reality. I find Swedenborg particularly interesting because here's a man who came up with the concept of something like a neuron ahead of its discovery, and he also predicted the day he would die. And he was happy about it, according to Elizabeth Reynolds, his landlord's servant girl, who said he sounded as if he was going on holiday or to some merry-making, to use her words. Swedenborg wrote a letter to John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, telling him that he had been told in the world of spirits that Wesley wanted to speak to him. This startled Wesley, as he hadn't told anyone about his interest in Swedenborg and his spiritual claims. Wesley replied that he was going on a journey for 6 months and would contact Swedenborg on his return. Swedenborg replied that would be too late. That would be too late because he would be going to the spiritual world without return to the realm of the living on March the 29th, the exact day he died, so he predicted it. Swedenborg also believed in life on other planets and that God is infinite. He also said spiritual planes of existence feel far more real than our world. His view was very much Platonic, Neoplatonic, alongside Neoplatonism. He had also visited Queen Louisa Ulrika of Sweden, and when she asked him to tell her something about her deceased brother, Prince Augustus William of Prussia, Swedenborg whispered something in her ear that turned the Queen pale, and she explained that this was something only she and her brother could know about. I've also had 2 extraordinary lucid dreams years ago where I visited amazing places, which perhaps gives me an idea of the visions these people are talking about when they report knowing or having seen the other side. The earliest took me to an environment that could only be described as heaven. A place characterized by mystical forests, an undulant river, perfectly cropped trees, rainbows, golden cities in the clouds, fairy tale cottages in the suburbs, mesmerizing flute-like sounds and chirps pervading the atmosphere, and beautiful people. There was a profound experience of love and exhilaration. Later I found, to my surprise, these descriptions in a book by Dave Fontana about the afterlife, where mediums channeled deceased people and they would describe to their living loved ones where they were. The other lucid dream was a hyperspace full of wormholes that led to many worlds, and I spent my time flying free and playing hide and seek with a friendly dream character. The dream ended with me landing in a memory-based environment redolent of my childhood, which culminated in the loss of lucidity and the belief that I was a child again. My mother was calling me to have dinner, and then I woke up, perplexed. I've tried to create a lucid dream workshop before, like an Oneiric nexus, which would lead me to a diversity of psychologically useful environments. But I abandoned the project, perhaps prematurely, as a niggling voice in my head insisted that my mind could exceed my expectations. All sorts can be experienced in the gamma brainwave frequency that is associated with lucid dreaming. Regular dreaming is where we are conscious, but we don't know that we are dreaming, and we lack critical thought. We embrace the abstract to the point where even nonsensical dream plots appear to make sense. Anything goes, including paradoxical events, and we accept it, taking all at face value. But when we become lucid, we realize that we are dreaming, and we see right through the illusion. Our critical thinking kicks in as we notice anomalies. We realize something is off, and we remember the strict rules of waking life. The lucid dreamer clearly resembles the waking self very closely, as it also recalls real events whilst in the dream world. You remember that you're in bed asleep. Lucidity is clearly analogous to metacognition, if not the same thing. Undoubtedly, our consciousness has infinite potential to experience what it is like to be anything. I don't doubt the possibility that my consciousness can forget human experience and identify with being something else. I could die a person today and wake up tomorrow as a puppy, and all I know in that moment is the simple mind of a canine. Undoubtedly, if you tamper with your noodle, you are guaranteed to feel different about yourself and the rest of the world. Simply drinking enough alcohol is evidence that brain activity and mind correlate. Of course, the physicalist has a tendency to commit the cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. The idealist knows correlation isn't necessarily causation, in that one doesn't have to cause the other. There is only evidence of mutual influence. Consciousness underpins all appearances, including the brain. So it's not surprising to see correlation. The brain is also made of the same medium, mind. My friend Nini made some interesting observations about acceleration and gravity a while ago, where the experience of stillness is affected. It reminded me of reports of people who survived falling from great heights, who experienced time slowing down and were able to think faster than normal, as they ostensibly fell in slow motion. This could be the result of evolution, such as a mode of temporal perception, which is radically different from our default mode, could mean the difference between being quick enough to grab a nearby branch to survive or falling all the way to your own demise. So there is definitely something there to do with time. Why should the perception of time slow down? And then you realize that in those extreme cases where people have come close to their demise and survived to tell an interesting tale, saying things like, "It seemed to me like time didn't exist," it starts to paint a picture, like the closer you are to death, the closer you are to truth, that time doesn't really exist. It's only a perception in the mind. Mind is all there is, because often we try to define the present moment as something in between the past and the future, but then you realize that the past no longer exists. It's already happened. It's already gone. Those events are already past. So the past is something is like an abstraction, a concept that no longer manifests. It's gone. And then you also realize that the future is also an abstraction. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't manifested. It doesn't exist either. So what remains in between? How thick is the present? Where's that dividing line between past and future? And divides what? Non-existent states? So there is only what we experience. And it seems like the closer you get to death, the closer you get to the truth. There is no time. Time is an illusion. So the ancients observed these experiences as well, and even used them to work out the most plausible metaphysics, where mind is primary and precedes even time. But physical idealism is not a new religion unfolding at all, as some physicalists are now trying to claim in their ignorance of philosophical history. The idea has been around for thousands of years. Just look up the Vedas, Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Advaita Vedanta, Shaivism, Hermetica, and Neoplatonism. And you can also look at pre-Socratic Anaxagoras, who introduced the concept of the nous, which is a cosmic mind, at a time when animism and hylozoism already existed. This was a time when Parmenides pondered about the earth being a sphere. Not long after that, you get Platonic idealism, or realism, and Plotinus, who inspired Neoplatonic thought, paving the way to monadism and so forth after that. The world is mind in action. It's true in dreams as well as waking life. In my experience, if one is trying to make things happen in lucid dreams, one must believe that dream environments will bend to one's will. If, for instance, you stand lucid in a dream replica of your bedroom, and you'd like to teleport to the moon by closing and opening your eyes as a method to achieve this, the following attitude must be adopted. Confidence and expectation are the keys. Close your eyes and believe that you are already standing on the lunar surface, and you know that when you open your eyes, you will logically see an Earth rise on the horizon. With your eyes shut, you already feel that your feet touching lunar soil. The ground you feel already belongs to the moon, no doubt. It's there. Believe it. It's there. Know it's there. You feel it, and your sight is about to confirm it. Open your eyes and you will see that you are on a dream moon, because it makes sense. The approach I've just described is the most effective, at least in my experience. Wishing doesn't always work because it hinges on hope, and your subconscious knows wishes don't always come true. Wishing is tantamount to telling yourself that you haven't left the bedroom. Therefore, it hasn't happened yet, which doesn't help. The psychology that undergirds it is predicated on the logic that wishing necessitates a terminus a quo, away from the target. In other words, the subconscious tells you, of course the goal hasn't materialized. If it did, you wouldn't wish for it. The trouble with lucid dreaming is that the mind, as a navigation system, is too accurate. It takes every mental nuance into account. You don't have to make wishes in a world that belongs to you. You are God. You dictate what you say goes. You are the Morpheus of your dream world, and Morpheus doesn't believe in barriers. Don't just think you are, know you are. Do you remember those words from the film? This is the best advice any aspirant lucid dreamer can get, and try not to have preconceptions about what presents itself on your Oneiric screen of perception. Like the assumption that solipsism is true in dreams. It does seem that solipsism is true in dreams in hindsight, but we can't even be sure that that's true. We may recall dreams and recognise that the characters we interacted with behaved in a bizarre or even nonsensical manner, and that for this reason they couldn't possibly be real sentient beings with an independent existence. But perceived behaviour is insufficient to write them off as merely imagined when we recognise that we too were immersed in nonsensical plots and believed them to be normal and nothing out of the ordinary. We lacked critical thinking and logic in dreams, and yet we were consciously real while they happened. We may even wake up and realise that we ourselves behaved oddly or reacted to perceived events in unexpected ways that we never imagined. In fact, we can also surprise ourselves in waking life. And then we have lucid dreams, where the dreamer is aware that he or she is dreaming whilst it's happening. Lucid dreamers resemble the waking self very closely because they are able to think critically in dreams, and they know they are asleep and perceiving a fluid illusion that can bend to their will. Lucid dreamers with enough confidence can also alter the appearance of the dream world and even manipulate and mould other characters. So now you may think that this is evidence for Oneiric solipsism, at least. But this would still be a premature conclusion when we realise that dreams are appearances in perception with characteristics that represent mentation. Dream characters could still be symbols representing other centres of awareness apart from your own focus, just as the avatars in a computer game represent the gamers that control them in real life. And you may think that a single dream shared by a plurality of loci of consciousness is only a flimsy hypothesis, but we know of instances where multiple personalities appear to inhabit a single body, as in the case of dissociative identity disorder. And we know what happens to split brain patients as a result of callosotomies. Two distinctly independent minds emerge, so it is conceivable that our personalities as a whole are made of sub-personalities, and these sentient individuals may be accessed by us through dreaming. The distortions and fading of dreams before they come to an end could simply reflect a failure to focus on inner realities, or a failure to maintain the tuning of that channel, so to speak. Just like when a game glitches and we may perceive distortions in the playing characters and environment on the screen. We may interact with the characters as representations, but never directly with the players in the real world, made of flesh, which would be analogous to the sentient forces that may be behind the colourful representations of the dream world. Of course, this is all very hypothetical, but it serves to drive home an important point. Even dreams don't guarantee solipsism as much as we think they do. And I won't even go into reports of shared dreaming where two people or more in waking life appear to have shared the same dream, and also cases where deceased people have sometimes apparently communicated to the living via their dreams and provided them with information that they couldn't possibly have known about through conventional means. Of course, such cases tend to be dismissed as wild guesses or coincidences, but I would urge people to get into the habit of recording their dreams. The more you record, the more you remember, because your focus starts to shift as you tell your subconscious mind that it's important to remember dreams. I've been an avid lucid dreamer now for over 15 years, and I have already had some striking experiences which appear to relate to things beyond my personal subjectivity and ostensibly affirm telepathy, precognition, and some kind of interconnectedness. In my conversation with Sally Taylor, I mentioned an OBE I had where I overlooked the neighbourhood I used to live in, and I saw how a biker crashed into a vehicle that belonged to one of my neighbours. The event happened 2 weeks after my experience and involved the same neighbour who had come out of his house to confront the biker, exactly like in my experience. But it also needs to be mentioned that prior to my OBE and the actual event, me and my wife were worried about bikes crashing into vehicles or people as gangs were riding to and fro selling drugs in the neighbourhood. A skeptic might also add that the accuracies of my experience were coincidental and that I merely hallucinated something that had already been on my mind, and that brains are Bayesian machines that make remarkable predictions about the future. I'll let you be the judge of that and won't say anything further about this. We should question everything, including these physicalist theories about the origin of such precognitive or predictive experiences. I've also had experiences both in dreams and lucid dreams which made me question Oneiric solipsism, which most people assume to be true. Yes, it's true that in philosophical idealism we are all one mind, as represented by a unified field, but I think it's possible that we encounter dissociated alters in our personal minds in dreams. We have examples of multiple personality disorder, and I have also experienced the awareness or some kind of intelligence behind the dream, which I spoke to Robert Wagner about. I know one can say that the dreaming mind can create anything, including semblances of sentience, but this still doesn't rule out the possibility that solipsism isn't the case in dreams, especially when the same thing can be said about waking lives, where some people can hallucinate, like John Nash, until they realise they were under the influence of a paranoid delusion. John Nash was a schizophrenic. And even though it is true that Nash experienced a delusion while awake, it didn't mean that everything about the waking world was delusional or fake. When he finally had a moment of lucidity, after realising that one of his hallucinated characters hadn't aged, he still trusted the aspects of the waking world that we can all agree on. And what we can agree on, which can be empirically verified, is important. Science is important. But we should avoid scientism and dogmatism, which is what makes materialist scientists appeal to promissory physicalism when addressing the hard problem of consciousness. They tend to say, don't worry, in 20 to 50 years' time we will know more about neural activity and quantum mechanics, and strong emergence will solve the mind-body problem. Where and when have we heard this before? It's been said for decades ad nauseum, and no progress. An example being the 25-year-old bet that the neurophysiologist Christoph Koch lost to David Chalmers pertaining to the neural correlates to test Tononi's integrated information theory. Even Koch is now seriously considering Donald Hoffman's conscious realism and Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism. The more conservative ones, that come from the schools of behaviorism and functionalism, are having a harder time jettisoning their doctrine and insist on pointing out that all they see is a tangible brain, the neural connections under a microscope, and the body with its organs is the object that they can study, never pondering the answers to these questions. Is consciousness tangible? Because it's obviously real. Does consciousness exist? Or is it just an illusion reducible to the activity of brain matter? Never considering the meaning of illusion and its implications apropos of consciousness. They never notice the irreducibility of consciousness. They never notice that it's not possible to be mistaken about being conscious. They also conflate solipsism with idealism and don't realize that the latter also uses a justified theory of mind in order to circumvent the former. Perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that when we are dealing with the quantum realm, human logic goes straight out the window. Reductionism and realism certainly have their uses, but they are not the be-all and end-all when it comes to understanding reality or working with it. Realism has proven to be a reliable assumption so far. I can trust that whatever I have typed on my memo will be there at a later stage when I check it. As far as I can tell, there is a world beyond my mind, and it makes sense to me that things are happening on the other side of the planet which I'm not aware of. I always have to remind myself that inductive reasoning is a bottom-up approach and deductive reasoning is top-down. The former aims at constructing a theory and the latter is concerned with testing an existing one. John Vervaeke gets our attention to the fact that there is an infinite amount of information that you can be privy to and explore to see if it's relevant to you, but it would take you an infinite amount of time as a human being to figure all that out. Time that a human being doesn't have, but we are intelligent as finite beings because of the amount of information that we ignore, focusing only on what's relevant to us. Vervaeke is definitely an interesting voice to heed, not just philosophically but also sociologically. One of my favourite quotes by him, which he said on Andre Ducham's Know Thyself podcast, is universities are the canaries in the coal mine of culture. Yeah, universities are the canaries in the coal mine of culture. Brilliant. We can certainly be circumspect by observing what happens in universities apropos of politics, and the chaos we've witnessed lately has caused much consternation and division. Vervaeke also talks about the interconnectedness of reality and how we explore abstract space using the associations we learned, our imagination and our aims towards change and storytelling. He uses the example of our tongues, which find utility in tasting things, but we also discovered that they can be used for communication or even entertainment when we pull faces, make noises with them, and in doing so make others laugh, or in the least get a reaction from them. And if you want to know more about how relevance realization can't be captured computationally, John Vervaeke is the man. In fact, he's published a paper about it. It's a process of discovery as human beings with our personal unconscious, which is connected to the collective unconscious. And Jung's collective unconscious, by the way, is Aldous Huxley's mind at large. It is universal consciousness at play, which includes our current personal minds or human egos. The unconscious part is a bit of a misnomer, because the mind of nature as a whole is indeed aware. Consciousness is, after all, the ultimate reality, so the collective unconscious is indeed conscious. Only that which we are not aware of from the anthropic perspective can be considered unconscious, only in the sense that we are not privy to the information that never gets filtered into our brains, because, after all, a human has a finite and constricted perspective. That information which is unconscious to us as living beings isn't necessarily unconscious to the mind at large. In fact, even the mind at large isn't entirely out of bounds to us, because we are only partially dissociated in experience. Therefore, the collective can still influence us in subliminal, archetypal and mysterious ways, so it might be more appropriate to call it subconscious from the human standpoint, as it's not the main focus. Some of you might think that monistic idealism affirms solipsism because if we are all one mind, then it means that only the mind of God exists. But usually, when philosophers talk about solipsism, they mean that only a personal, limited human mind exists, and everything else is a product of that mind. This is not true of philosophical idealism. The analytic idealism of Bernardo Castro, for example, emphasizes the proposition that we are partially dissociated alters of a mind at large, like whirlpools on a vast ocean. The whirlpools are still real manifestations, even though ultimately only water exists and the ocean is doing everything. It's waving. Water is, in this analogy, consciousness. The plurality of personal minds doesn't become less real just because it is contained within a monistic whole. It is sometimes said in mystical circles that love is the binding attractive force of the universe, which paradoxically maintains the one reality and also creates diversity. All comes out of love. The ontological primitive creates the illusion of separation and a palpable diversity out of love. And as it was said by the alchemist, love is a wish to know, and imagination holds all truths. In monistic idealism, consciousness is the thing in itself, and its contents are phenomenal. The contents are mere representations of what the underlying reality is doing. So, to prematurely assume that dream figures are the Oneiric noumena, instead of considering the plausible possibility that they are merely representative of real noumenal forces, is potentially akin to mistaking the smile for happiness. It's the same mistake physicalists make when they say the mind is what the brain does. Actually, it's the opposite. They only say it's the brain because they appear to correlate, thereby committing the cum hoc ergo propter hoc fallacy. Just because the voices on the radio might become garbled doesn't mean that there aren't real people behind them. It just means that we might have lost the signal. And the same goes for waking life. Solipsism is an unfalsifiable proposition, but a problem nonetheless. Some people, like Felipe Bautista, will try to convince you that idealism, or any other metaphysic for that matter, which makes a small leap of faith to posit many minds, is dishonest and fallacious. But we justify that small leap with the theory of mind, which we have been psychologically developing since infancy. The theory of mind circumvents the problem of solipsism by emphasizing the fact that everything about our social world in our field of awareness looks as though a plurality of minds exists, even if there is a chance that this appearance could be simulated. And yes, the theory of mind also reasons that if it's possible for a single personal mind to exist, such as our own, then in theory other minds could too. For we know of no laws forbidding the existence of other personal minds, or only permitting the existence of one. Idealism also recognizes that the only thing we can be 100% sure of is that we are conscious, so it can't be dishonest. The contents of consciousness, however, may be illusory, not what we think they are. But we may have different degrees of confidence that something is true, such as solipsism most likely being false. How confident can we be that we interact with other minds? What percentage? And I'm going to tell you now from the outset that if you say 0% like Felipe Bautista, you are being dishonest. We can say that we are at least 50% confident, perhaps even a little bit more than that, but never 100% if we are to remain epistemologically consistent. I'd say I have a fairly good degree of confidence that solipsism is most likely false based on extremely compelling evidence received through my senses. But it's a strong theory, not absolute certainty, which I think Felipe conflates. He conflates the two for some reason. I would be very surprised to find that I am the only mind and everything is a figment of my imagination. It would mean that in the course of my life I only interacted with semblances of sentience in my mind. And if Felipe is listening, solipsism cannot be an honest position, by the way, because to affirm it is to believe with certainty that only your personal mind exists and everything else is purely imagined, and you can't sustain this position because it carries an impossible burden of proof. Yes, you have the burden of proof. The only epistemologically honest, as it were, position is agnosticism. But you can certainly have different degrees of confidence under the rubric of belief, where you get doubt or rejection on one end and absolute certainty or knowledge on the other. Hence why it is said that knowledge is a subset of belief in propositional logic. Affirming solipsism also requires us to explain why the world is deceptive. Why is the illusion of a plurality of minds so strong on the screen of perception? Is the mind in the solipsistic context deliberately deluding itself with a fantasy of fellowship and company, or is the appearance of mental plurality explained by a brain in a vat scenario? If it's the latter, then solipsism is false, because an extra mind or a pair or group of technological minds is required to pull the wool over the eyes of the mind being deceived about the real world. Like what happens to Jim Carrey's character in The Truman Show. Affirming solipsism would require you to gather evidence to explain why the world appears the way it does, with the illusion of an interactive society, when the premise that there is only your personal mind hasn't even been established beyond reasonable doubt. Many of you dislike the uncertainty, the position of not knowing. It's natural. After all, knowledge brings closure, and people also say knowledge is power. Some of you even view agnosticism as a cowardly position that some insist upon for fear of being opinionated. But agnosticism is only cowardly when people remain neutral so as to not upset others with opposing views. I would say that in the face of evidence being inconclusive, it takes a brave and honest person to say, "I don't know," when this is really the case. This kind of humility is courageous and should be admirable. Pretending to know in order to inflate one's ego is what is cowardly, but one shouldn't be dogmatic in agnosticism either, as agnosticism should only be a provisional position pending further evidence. I would recommend that you watch The Ravine, a film by the Pascuzzis and directed by Keone Waxman, if you haven't seen it already, of course. It's a dramatic story inspired by real events. It conveys both spiritual and physical realities in unison, touching upon the mystery of God or the concept as something ineffable. The theme of unconditional love is also covered, and what it entails, and the moral hierarchy as a human construct, in particular when addressing misdeeds and appraising individuals for judgment and punishment. The story conveys interconnectedness and involves theft, grievous bodily harm, murder, suicide, and forgiveness. Some of you will find it very close to home, unfortunately. It also involves a wise woman who appears to be like an angel on earth, who has visions and knows things she couldn't possibly know about through conventional means. Someone that many would call a medium, though that word is never mentioned. She helps people affected by tragedy and provides guidance, and she's very warm and kind. The film also explores her childhood. As a little girl, when her father was bedridden at home and dying, she was outside playing in the front garden when she saw a kaleidoscope of butterflies and a bubble of blue energy is seen exiting the house from the wall behind which is the bedroom where the father lay dying. This beautiful bubble then shoots up towards the sky. She runs back to the house and tells her mother that the angels took Daddy to heaven. The mother, who had been busy with chores, tells the girl that her dad is just fine and sleeping in the bedroom, not realizing that he had already passed away. If you doubt that such a thing can happen, then, on what grounds? Remember that Darwinism doesn't explain consciousness, and Neo-Darwinism in particular has a tendency to become entangled in self-contradiction. Darwin himself wondered if the human mind could be trusted, since it had descended from the lowest animal, as he believed. According to Darwinism, the mind must have evolved as a means to survival, not as a creative agent with the potential for arriving at the truth of any sort. But if this is true, then it means that mechanistic biologists have no reason to believe in any scientific theory, including their own. For the mind of man is no more than a useless evolutionary accident. Perhaps most astonishing is the suggestion that consciousness does not exist, since it's not detectable by physics or chemistry, as the neurologist Lawrence Kuby once reasoned. When philosopher Michael Polanyi objected to the absurdity of regarding humans as insentient automata, Ralph Gerard, a neurophysiologist and behaviourist, retorted, "One thing we know, ideas don't move muscles." Well, if that were true, Gerard, you wouldn't be able to utter a single word, would you? And there is certainly some truth to the clairvoyance or apparent extrasensory perception depicted in The Ravine. Puzzling events like that do occur, and people scratch their heads and come up with many theories. In my interaction with Edith from Emily's Visions, I touched upon OBE telepathy, which seems to happen when we wish to visit people in out-of-body experiences. In my case, I found that the people I visited confirmed to me that I appeared to view the things that were on their minds at the time, implying that we always travel in a mental realm. For example, when I visited a friend of mine in an OBE, I apparently separated from my body into what looked like an inaccurate replica of my bedroom. And then, thinking about seeing him, I ended up travelling through a wormhole and reached an equally inaccurate replica of his house. And there, as I floated near the ceiling of his bedroom, I could see him sitting on the floor in a meditative position with CDs on the floor surrounding him, and the walls of his bedroom were blue, which wasn't the case in real life. When my awareness returned to my body, I got up and immediately wrote everything down. Then I called him to tell him about my OBE visit, and he was in shock because, unbeknownst to me, he had been reading about Buddhism and had been meditating. And he also added that lately he had been trying to get rid of his CDs as a test to see if he could be happy without the music that he liked so much, in a bid to tackle his desires. And before I could even describe his bedroom, he asked me if, in my experience, the walls in his bedroom were blue. I confirmed it, and he proceeded to tell me that he had been thinking about decorating his house and painting the walls blue. So the walls weren't blue yet. So he had been thinking. So if he already visualized it, could I have picked up on this in my altered state of consciousness? Experiences like these, plus coming across the mental entanglement theory by the late Professor Michael Persinger, who invented the God helmet and conducted remote viewing experiments with Ingo Swann and others, made me take ESP, extrasensory perception, more seriously. Persinger posited that the quantum entanglement of minds is possible within the geomagnetic field, which makes me think that perhaps sometimes the more favourable conditions within this field increase the chances of lucid dream telepathy. And it may be the case that when we notice that the lucid dream replicas of our abodes don't match those of waking life in a precise manner is due to the fact that memory doesn't always get things right. So we may perceive an elaborate gist of what is actually the case in waking life. Or sometimes the inaccurate replicas we encounter in those altered states are based on how we sometimes imagine them to be from desire and the very creativity of our imagination. A picture of slight changes to what we are already familiar with, as the mind is like a storm, never at rest, against the backdrop of a clear sky that is analogous to the stillness of pure consciousness. And that's okay. And I say this because the best meditation is to simply observe what is without judgment. I like John Kabat-Zinn's definition of mindfulness. Mindfulness is awareness that arises through paying attention on purpose in the present moment, non-judgmentally, in the service of self-understanding and wisdom. Mental realities, then, would be nothing but symbols or representations in motion, conveying concepts and meaning, communicating information, and derivatives of an infinite pleroma, the totality, the infinite. The inaccurate replicas could be largely based on memories, but also partially influenced by intricate webs of mental schemas. There could be extra layers of perception that we impose on the screen of perception that we are already familiar with in this reality, and perhaps in the case of OBEs and NDEs we may acquire a new screen of perception that incorporates more information, but this of course is more speculative. We could also use the concept of multi-dimensions as another way to conceptualize what's going on. In any case, I would maintain that the dynamics are certainly mental in nature, pretty much like everything else. As for life, I would say that it is a self-sustaining pattern capable of resisting entropy or decay at an ever-improving capacity over time. I'm going to leave you here with two appropriate quotes by Carl Jung. There is a voice within the deep, from the shadow side. There is a voice that's guiding me, a blister in my mind. I have a vision of a world where rodents roam, and I can see how the fabric weaves the underworld and land of dreams embrace eternally. My soul is caught between. There is a voice enticing me into chasms still unknown. Feelings only act as gates. Fear is just a stepping stone. And there's something from chapter 5 of Ion, researches into the phenomenology of the self. No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell. Unquote. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and have a Merry Christmas.